Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes, let the room fill in. So hang tight, introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like, and we'll get started shortly. And I'll keep repeating this message a couple of times, but we should get started at about 12:02, 12:03. So just hang tight and we'll get started shortly. Welcome to those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes as we wait for folks to get into the webinar. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Hang tight, introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like, and we'll get started shortly. I'll repeat this message a couple of times as new folks are joining in. So thank you. Welcome to those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for the room to fill in, waiting for any last minute arrivals. We should get started in about a minute or so. Repeat the message probably one more time, and then we'll get started. Thanks for being here today. Cool. So I think everyone is in. So we'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this Intro to Tech Equity style webinar. I hope y'all can hear and see me. If you have any troubles with anything tech related, please drop that into the chat. I'll try to help. But I do also want to say that the webinar is being recorded and that recording will be shared afterwards, as well as the presentation slides in case you miss anything. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager here at TechEquity Collaborative. And in my role, I get to engage with our community and our supporters through events, webinars such as these, volunteer opportunities, campaign opportunities, and I get to engage with you all here. So glad you're here with us. Feel free to drop in any questions into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screens as we go through the presentation, but we won't answer any of those questions until the end. As I mentioned, we'll send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording, a link to the presentation slides, a bit more information about what we talk about today, and that's also another space to ask your questions in case anything comes up later in the day. So here's what we'll talk about today. We'll talk a little bit about why TechEquity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved and how we can take action to address some of these issues. But first, let's start with why we're here. So TechEquity got started because some of its founders and early members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods, and they understood that there was this perception that tech workers were the cause of these problems. And they noticed some of these issues going around them, such as rising rents, increases in displacement, increases in people experiencing homelessness, and increases in traffic. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they, as tech workers, were uniquely positioned to help address some of these issues and contribute solutions to these issues. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. And many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. At the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed these last couple of years. So as a result, the pandemic that we're currently living in has the potential to even further exacerbate some of this inequality in our region that some of our founders were already seeing many years ago. So because of our affordability crisis, communities are frustrated and it really comes at no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've kind of been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their community, what that means for them. Do they have to move out? Do they have to get on a second job? But I also have friends and family who pursue jobs within the tech industry and have found lots of success. They really like it. They're able to grow their families and support their families. However, we see that when tech is shouldering the blame, it starts to create this us versus them dynamic that's even further dividing our communities. And we know that tech workers care, that they want to help, and they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide. So while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal that's caused by the pandemic, it's important to note, like we said, that many in the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed. More than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support better and more equitable solutions in our communities. So we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can sometimes be hard to know how to best engage, especially in times of such uncertainty. So this is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area, at least. That's where we're headquartered. The fact that rents are rising shouldn't be a surprise to anyone on this call, because we all know, we feel this, we've heard this from friends and family, or are personally experiencing it. And while some Californians are very successful in this tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. And as I mentioned, we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based as an organization, and it's where tech is headquartered. But a version of this story is being played out all across the country, especially in cities that are up and coming tech hubs. And this really is a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success. And without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members get frustrated, like we just talked about. Just before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. When the virus hit, unemployment claims had spiked up to 16%. I think many of you had heard that, which was a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So in the span of a month, we lost decades worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we're seeing that more of our neighbors are being pushed into homelessness or worse. So at TechEquity Collaborative, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it won't happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities, and we have to show up. And we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. We believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to the issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. So we know we can do this, and the first step is to show up. And y'all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar today and trying to learn the ins and out of what's going on in our communities. Our goal is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. So we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. So we help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. And we do this in a variety of ways. We host book club discussions, panel discussions with experts in the field of topic for the webinar. We host webinars such as these. We produce voter guides around voter season, really trying to expand the pool of different ways to educate folks that are coming into our network. We also advocate for public policy that's rebalancing power and building economic equity. And a great example of that is the work we helped in coalition with with tenants, with organizations, state legislators, and that's the Tenant Protection Act of 2019. It was a bill that passed in 2019 and now extends protections to 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community. And we have corporate partnerships and engagements as part of our programming as well. Tech workers have this outsized political power that is largely untapped to when it comes to public policy advocacy. And we believe that connecting tech workers to outside perspectives builds more empathy and ethical practices in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. At TechEquity, our two issue areas are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of this, these issues really are intertwined and intersect in a variety of ways because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agendas to these new realities. So while the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity in our neighborhoods and a history of some of these policies. So this affordability crisis is actually decades in the making, and the policy choices that we've made over the course of decades have set us up for the level of pain our communities feeling, especially now during the pandemic. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area and California and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined, as we can see with the image on the screen. Each one of those blocks, those red blocks, are red line neighborhoods in the city of San Francisco here in California. And those communities were deemed risky investments and didn't receive any investment at all. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. In other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for something like maintaining their homes, for like building a new roof or something like that. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. And there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. So the crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech's arrival, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. It extends across California and across the country. So these are examples of redline neighborhoods in Austin, that's the map on the left, and in Atlanta, that's the map on the right. Both of these cities are up and coming tech hubs that are facing similar issues and similar issues as we are here in the Bay Area. And once again, those red blocks you see all over those maps are historically redlined neighborhoods. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who have lived in redline neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock can be something like a huge rent increase. You suddenly lose your job, your car breaks down, and you have a huge bill to pay for maintenance. and it impacts almost 1 out of 3 Californians. So 33.9% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates, with 41.2% of African American households in liquid asset poverty and 56.2% of Latino households in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening. As we talked about, many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. And the twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that aren't covering the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics likely will be impacted by the outcomes of the pandemic. Many of the people in our communities were already struggling. And as the pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and unequal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come. As we can see here in this chart, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. So according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. And this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. So while all workers have lost out because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. And while there's a gap between pay and productivity, like we just talked about, there's also a pay gap between race. White men are earning more cents to the dollar. That's that orange bar on the left. And in comparison to Black men and women, the blue bars on the right. And because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to afford living in the cities that are providing good jobs. So the cost of living here were already high. So let's take a look at how a worker who's earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford the average 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. If you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average 2-bedroom working a regular 8-hour day. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom. Again, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom apartment. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're actually setting up an impossible situation for low wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work in. And this problem persists across the country. And even though costs in upcoming tech cities like Austin, Denver, and Atlanta aren't as high as San Francisco, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone earning minimum wage within these cities. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making 6 figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or in marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, bus drivers, who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment, but why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA goals, and that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal, for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that big blue bar on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable to people making the good salary we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. Those are the two small red bars on the left side of your screen. And as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember, when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. Because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities at higher rates, while people with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, those are those orange bars, have left San Francisco at higher rates, while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% are in a more drastic situation where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco, as they're being pushed into homelessness or worse. So that's actually why that last blue bar at the bottom of the chart is actually increasing, because there just isn't enough affordable housing available to help support the most vulnerable members of our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are even more tragic. As we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are living in liquid asset poverty at higher rates. And furthermore, Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years. So a combination of discriminatory housing laws, such as redlining, low wages, and a lack of affordable housing production have created a crisis of displacement. So displacement really is driven by policy choices. And we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress, because the folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are the ones that got hit the hardest by our current crisis. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. But the good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. We can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems, and we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity in our tech economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is a result of years of bad policy choices. But the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. At TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. We've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve it without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production. So making sure that we're building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reforms that bring down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build homes. Preservation, making sure we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. Protection, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build the necessary housing that we need, but in the meantime, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially in housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing, so we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we need to be thinking about short and long-term solutions to preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors are more at risk now than ever as a result of the current crisis. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and a stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role. So we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse workers, and contract workers. So, in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, and making sure that the workplace is safe and ensuring that there is fair scheduling. We also need to expand and equip the workforce. So training as a standalone approach is not going to lead us out of inequality and will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. In order to solve this crisis, we must take multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. And we must strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved. We host tons of educational and social events. You can check out our past events page. We have recordings of everything that we've hosted this year. If you're interested in public policy, you can support some of our 2022 priority legislation, which I'll be talking about next. You can share your story if you're a contract worker to support our contract worker disparity project. You can reach out to me and I can point you in the right direction, talk to you a little bit more about some of our programming and maybe where you fit in. For corporate practice, we do offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get more involved on these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So also you can reply to our follow-up email and we can connect you with our corporate partnerships manager if that's something you're interested in. So this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible, but making sure that we're building community in the process. This year, we have a couple of key initiatives that begin with the Contract Worker Disparity Project. So it's a first of its kind. It's a worker-centered initiative that sheds light on the practice of contracting out and proposes and advocates for public policy solutions and partners with companies to adopt responsible contracting practices. We also have the Tech Bias and Housing Initiative. So this examines the promise and perils of housing technology. So we aim to ensure that technological innovations in the housing space do not reinforce the racist housing systems and policies of the past, like we talked about earlier. Passing economic justice policy. So every year, TechEquity introduces a bold policy agenda that addresses economic inequality in the housing market and in the workplace. So our priority this year's are housing data transparency, equitable labor standards, affordable housing, data surveillance protections, and more. And finally, there's the System Reset Initiative, which is helping tech companies create on-ramps for people returning from incarceration. We're partnering with justice-involved people and organizations to get system reset into every tech company in California. So what can you do today? Well, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work, have them sign up. You can sign up for a community conversation. So that's just an opportunity to meet with me one-on-one via Zoom. And we can talk about, how do you like to participate, or you can ask more questions on an individual level. And finally, you can take action with us by becoming, a volunteer on one of our campaigns or a project that we're working on. So now I'll move on to one of our priority legislations. So the first one that we have is the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act. This is also known as Senate Bill SB 1162. And this would make pay equity reports public so that all workers have the information that they need to ensure that there is equal pay for equal work and ensure that companies create a fair and equal playing field for all workers by posting salaries in their job descriptions and posting promotional opportunities to their existing employees before selecting a candidate. So SB 1162 this week successfully passed the Senate floor and is now moving over to the assembly. So there's tons of ways to support bills such as this. So make sure to keep an eye out for upcoming info. For this bill in particular, we've had volunteers call in into committee meetings to voice their statements of support. You can also join us and sign on into a petition that you can sign on online. On events, as I mentioned, we host tons of events. We currently don't have anything upcoming, but you can check out our events page. And like I said, we have recordings of everything on there. And as I mentioned, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can sign up for a community conversation. That's just that opportunity to talk with me one-on-one on a more individual level, or you can take action on one of our bills. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information. So I'm going to take just like a minute or two for any quick questions you all may have. As I mentioned, the webinar is recorded. The presentation slides will be shared out along with the recording as well. Follow-up email should go out within the next couple of hours. And if you have any questions that you'd like answered on a more personal level, just respond back to that email and I can get back to you ASAP. So I'll just take a minute or so, not seeing any questions, and that's totally fine. If you think of any later, feel free to ask me. Cool. So I'm not seeing anything. That's totally fine. I want to thank you all for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join our growing movement. Hope to see some of you take action with us. Enjoy your long weekends, and thanks for signing on into this Friday during your lunch to talk about some of these things. Thank you.